Yeah, there are some slides. We managed to get some slides together. Actually, we had so many slides, it was a bit of a challenge to come up with some concise message, and I'm not sure we achieved that. I guess it's too much material, and the group is actually quite diverse, and that's probably an reflection of where we wanted to start. Initially, what we felt has already been addressed widely among rare populations or special populations like pediatrics, and therefore we wouldn't really need to focus on pediatrics, especially since there are a number of regulations around. We were wondering, are other examples or other diseases, areas, rare diseases are more interesting. But at the end, we ended up actually talking a lot about pediatrics because it is actually still, I guess, not really the area where all stakeholders agree on how to use modeling and simulation, and then had some extrapolations to other diseases. So Oscar had pulled some leading statements together, and Terry, Oscar, please add to if you feel there are things which are missing. But in essence, I guess an evidence approach is for rare diseases, special populations, essential because the evaluation of PK/PD is difficult there, and the evidence is often not there as we wish to have it, and therefore we are relying on interpolation, extrapolation, translation. There are a number of acronyms in use, and not all of them are liked really. And we had some discussions around them because bridging, for instance, gives the impression of a very positive and nicely integrated way of looking things, while actually extrapolation has a kind of negative connotation. And I think in the majority of the cases we do extrapolate here. So the question is not only to support the evidence synthesis at the analysis stage. That's probably of minor importance, and we're not talking about the exercise of analyzing the data, but actually driving the design in those special populations and taking the evidence forward, the limited evidence forward, in making regulatory or otherwise decisions within companies. So there are a lot of assumptions usually involved in this, and there are obviously a number of outcomes. We might not know them, but in general, we obviously can violate assumptions easily. And if we don't wish to do that, then we need to mitigate against this somehow. And there obviously the worst case outcome, so to say, is always if you just say, oh, we don't know what to do in that special population, so don't give it a drug in the first place. Or on the inverse, we say we don't know it, but we still take the risk forward and ask the stakeholder to basically provide additional evidence. Now, you saw the slide here from Peter. I'm just going through this because I think, here on this side, it looks like the measure is on the randomized controlled trial, the evidence side, but actually on rare populations and pediatrics is really on the other side. And we need to think about what consequences that has in a any clinical development program. So the Terry put the slide together here about the high, low, medium impact, and if you go into pediatrics or special populations, obviously the majority of programs we were looking at, and those were the case example we discussed, are all kind of high impact because in general the evidence is being substituted for by a suitable model, and obviously all parties then agree or disagree whether that substitution actually is acceptable or is eventually not acceptable. And we had some discussions about this. So we had 4 different areas, and I'm not kind of repeating kind of the case studies we were addressing, but just the general themes were kind of, in a mechanistic driven initial session, then followed by some PK/PD some PK/PD assessment about the taking the evidence forward from an adult population in a pediatric population, where not just the PK is being measured, but actually PK/PD alongside the sildenafil case. Then we had some discussion on correlations of covariates across populations and using various ethnic subgroups to ask the question whether we could actually dose a pediatric population. So it's a kind of relatively complicated, complex case. And then finally, we had some actually some interesting examples in how to handle, Bayesian prior, for instance, or using different ways of assessing assessing, I'm using the wrong one here, assessing the, a different approach in a way of historical data, utilizing historical data, as well as thinking, can we integrate actually the information we are not having, so kind of capturing all the assumptions in some way and coming up with a measure as to how to negotiate among the partners or provide a framework as to how the assumptions could be not really categorized but better communicated and allow the stakeholders in a way to agree as to whether a certain development plan or a certain inference is possible or acceptable. You see here the FDA flowchart, and everybody in the case, in our case, has actually utilized that. There were some discussions about this because we felt like there is, or not we, but some parties felt like this is an oversimplification at some stage, and we were not really terribly convinced that that could be applied in a special population circumstances. You saw here again something which Oscar and Mats and myself had looked at some time ago. The idea about kind of differentiating or separating the likelihood of violation from the consequence of actually having violated an assumption. And the drug development paradigm in general tries to kind of reduce the likelihood to violate, as well as kind of quantifies the importance, quantifies the importance of actually quantifies the consequence of breaking a given assumption. And I guess the purpose of a model-based approach here is actually to try to identify the areas or the populations in our case where actually the consequences can be managed, and identify those circumstances where it can't and where actually additional evidence needs to be gathered. So that's kind of the framework, and again, that's a slide you saw yesterday. The idea about that we kind of really try to capture all the assumptions, and there were discussions yesterday about the bias in the models one might actually look at. One could, in a similar way, look into the bias of what assumptions actually been looked at and which ones been kind of ignored or forgotten about. And I think there might be a divide between the stakeholders, whether it's regulatory or pharma, as to which assumptions they are willing to make, which assumptions they might not want to make, or which assumptions they simply forgot to evaluate while the program runs. And the assumptions turn into, you could assess them by the probability to violate as well as the consequence of having violated them, and then ask the question, what is modeling actually supporting here, and what are the implications for this evidence synthesis through a model-based approach, and at what stage actually additional evidence is coming through data. And I'm just showing here the example in relation to sildenafil, where we thought about this framework as, if we could really formalize each assumption, and you see here the red ones being indicated as coming kind of through early in the development plan, where we said the AUC in pediatrics is similar to adults, and we designed trials, and the violation of the assumption here would have had major implications on the inferences we derive from it. So the assumption is likely to, or was at that design stage, likely to be violated, and the consequence had been major or was major. Now, through the modeling approach and through some evidence through the PK, in that sense, a very easy example here, we basically brought the scaling factor into the equation, and the probability to violate actually got reduced a lot, and the consequence was moderate, or would have been moderate still to violate it, but the model allowed them to quantify the various factors driving it. Not talking about the other examples here, but the idea is that one really could think about a framework where each of those assumptions could be formalized and the probability could be quantified. Now, we had some discussions about what it actually means to assess the probability to violate an assumption. And there's not really a quantitative measure, because it's kind of a community assessment as to whether you might violate it without having the evidence in place, or you're not violating it. Yeah, so it depends on if you scale down the AUC from an adult population in the pediatric population without having measured anything, then it relies totally on the circumstances. So the idea, what Peter Bauer and Martin Posch had actually came up with this idea, is that usually the PDCO, for instance, in the pediatric circumstances, applies a one-sided, or very often it's applied a one-sided significance of 0.1 in all those trials which were being performed in pediatrics. And a 0.2 level, 0.25 level has actually been suggested, and one would wonder whether that would make any sense, because the risk actually to show a positive, to come up with a positive, false positive results is actually in that sense 10%, or in the worst case scenario even 25%. So the idea is, can we actually create some measure from this, and they came up with this idea of introducing a scale of skepticism factor, and the scale of skepticism factor S is actually the probability, or we could call it the probability, that the treatment is not effective in this given subpopulation we were wanting to extrapolate to, given that the extrapolation assumptions are actually incorrect. Yeah, so you could create a continuous stream on one end, and it's a ratio between a value and this. So I need to go back. And the significance level you actually apply to a trial. And there are two kind of extreme values to it. One is if the skepticism is actually very, very small, so you're very confident that there is no risk that you violate the assumption, and you would conclude that there's no additional evidence in whatever population you're looking for necessary to do. So basically, no additional data is ever necessary. On the other end, if actually the confidence level is the same as your skepticism factor, then the ratio, which is their measure they're introducing, is 1, then it would actually mean it's the other end of the spectrum, and it would actually tell you full evidence is necessary, meaning not only a singular trial, but probably even a pivotal or 2 pivotal trials in a given subpopulation, because you don't believe that you can anything translate from the existing data to the special population. Now, we thought about, can we actually, on this kind of scale, can we actually locate all our case examples? And I'm not talking to the 5 case examples here, but Sugammadex is the first one we were discussing, and has a very mechanistic understanding, and the model they came up with is very nicely integrated across the various populations, then make extrapolations to renal and young pediatric population, and saying basically that this mechanistic model is not going to change, or there's no alteration in any of those populations, extremely unlikely for various reasons, and therefore the additional evidence is not necessary. For topiramate, we had the opposite case here, because there is kind of an agreement, since it's even on the market or labeled, that actually some regulators in the room completely disagreed as to whether the disease which has been what has been labeled for now has anything to do with the disease where the majority of the development had run in the adult or elder population. So we talked as well about sildenafil. And they see the older children, probably there's the skepticism is actually quite small, so we are quite confident that there's no additional information necessary. In the younger children population for sildenafil, you could argue that the relationship between the endpoints is not very well understood, and the clinical signal is not very well described, and therefore one might actually ask for additional evidence.
Just now, another minute or two, please.
Yeah, so basically the Sugammadex is here. The point about the Sugammadex was at the end that there really needs to be some confirmation as to what the mechanistic model actually achieved, whether the regulator would actually ask to provide additional evidence in a subsequent assessment, or whether we would just live with the non-existent confirmation of the model output. Topiramate, there's a huge gap, or there's a gap in this pediatric population here, and the idea was to develop the drug in the very young children, and we had some argumentation about whether actually I only show you the criticism here that the various parties might reach a level of disagreement in a way that actually what the sponsors claim the epilepsy are similar, and actually they are quite different, and there's a lot of reason to believe that you treat 2 completely different populations, and whatever you actually introduce here by a low level of skepticism, measuring the PK only, and translating this in the very young population, you do a good job for the PK itself, but not for the dynamic effects, and therefore That was one of the arguments. The FDA kind of decision tree is not necessarily adequate in those circumstances and might lead to an oversimplification if you just apply the decision tree towards those development plans. So the question on that's pretty much the last slide. The negotiation on the skepticism level is kind of what the parties need to achieve, stating the assumption in the first place, and then creating a framework as to how you negotiate in case you violate the assumption and come to an agreement as to what the consequences are, whether it's a labor restriction in a way or whether additional evidence is necessary. And there was a lot of emphasis saying, what this additional evidence could actually be is obviously an internal sponsor new data set, or, and that talks to what Tom mentioned as well, some other external exercises, whether it's regulatory driven or whether it's consortia driven, to share data. And you see that here at the very bottom of this last slide, to basically ask academics and pharma to come together and share their data and experience. And I think the slide here just summarizes at the very end, what we would expect or require for future model-based approaches, and under the circumstances or the purpose of bridging extrapolation translation, the clinical pharmacology understanding needs to be better, and it's not just theoretical evidence, but actually empirical evidence, which I meant here, which is needs to be better. The mechanistic needs to be better understood, but the empirical evidence not overvalued. And there were some comments on the PBK-PK utilization. Obviously, Terry introduced, the backbone of PBK, which should have been used or should be used in all allometric instead of the majority of allometric scaling exercises. And Joe Standing, for instance, said, that the PD in this part of the equation is not really being considered properly. So all our PBK downscaling procedures basically a little bit ignore as to whether there's some possibility in making a better job in scaling the dynamic effects as well. Learning check and confirming what to do if important deviations appear. There's not really a framework in place as what to do in a special population if things go wrong, as to if a trial shows actually a deviation. And the Sildenafil again got kind of heavily criticized for those purposes, because one could have obviously run a very different trial if one had known at some stage in the trial that that the scaling, for instance, didn't work as we would have thought initially, and therefore an adaptation would have been necessary. But how to implement adaptations, that's obviously the majority of companies are, I wouldn't say reluctant, but hesitant in utilizing in a special population adaptive designs. But this is something probably the regulator needs to think about, how to engage or encourage parties to run more complex, whether it's Bayesian approaches or adaptive designs, to really improve the way the evidence is synthesized. And I think that's the last slide. I could show another example here, which we talked also about, but that's probably getting too much. And,
no, thank you.
Therefore,
all right. Thanks for the summary. I wonder if others from the session, Terry or Oscar or anybody else, can build on that summary to actually say what we need to do next. Yes, go on. Yes, please, Janet.
Hi, Janet Wade from Exprimo. I want to take it back a step from Lutz's extremely full and comprehensive summary and go back to a statement that was made right at the start of the session, which I think was one of the most important sentences made in the whole session, was that the regulators asked not just for models, they asked for mechanistic models. It wasn't an issue about modeling in this particular situation. They want mechanistic models, and I get that with appropriate assumption testing, because obviously that's part of the process. But if they have mechanistic models, it's going to be easier for them to bridge, translate, extrapolate, pick your word of choice, into these small populations where it's very difficult to get full traditional evidence in terms of showing that the drug is working and that a dose is appropriate for that population. So I want to make that most strongly. I was most impressed that was virtually the opening statement in the session.
You're impressed because you think that's the right way forward, to be clear. Not just because we'd heard of them. Yeah. Oscar.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think what we tried to achieve in this discussion was really, first of all, to frame the issue of inference in the context of pediatric research, and I think the focus ended up quite a lot being a pediatric development, where, again, mechanistic concepts may be easily applicable, where you try to think about PK and perhaps PK-PD. But I feel that the way forward is slightly further than that, which is we need to understand the way we make assumptions, because there will be situations where evidence from data may not be really available. And at the moment, we are left at subjective perception of the assessors or different agencies how to handle those disease conditions like rare diseases, or even moving across populations. And we're not talking only about Japan or China. You could consider an infinite number of ethnicities here. So it's really about how do you generate a set of assumptions that can be evaluated in a systematic manner, and how can we then use those model-based proposals to support our decision-making or the regulatory decision-making. And I'm not saying that we can always skip the need for evidence, but does the need for evidence need to be generated prior to approval? Can we think about a progressive licensing model like we have had in the past with some, let's say, fast-track conditions, where you actually wait for the evidence to be gathered, but to give manufacturers or industry the chance to evaluate that in real patients?
Maybe you could say a few more words about that final proposal and why it helps to have the license in place to gather the information.
Because sometimes you will have a situation where off-label, the intervention as an experimental intervention may be not appealing to patients, particularly even when standard of care may not be effective. That may still be a burden to convince patients to enter a trial, where the standard design may not be necessarily the most appealing one from a clinical perspective. I think there are practical challenges there. One is finding the patient. Second, you may still struggle in providing evidence from a traditional design. You still would need a design that is model-based, and that may be much more effective if you're running in a licensed manner.
Okay. From the regulatory side, Terry, perhaps?
There's a number of the points have already been covered, which were very important to me. Certainly this idea that if you're using mechanistic models, then you're moving towards the low end of the skepticism scale, which of course brings advantages in terms of additional studies that you have to do. That was a very important point. One of the points that came out that was a real surprise to me was that there were a number of examples where companies had done a full development in adults. They knew the metabolism, they knew the mechanisms, etc. And then they go into another population, and what they find is that, in fact, they don't know the metabolism. And so they're left in this situation. How do we handle that? And so if somebody can comment on this, I will be a bit extreme, but my impression was that they don't go back and fill in the gaps. And for me, it's a crazy waste not to do that.
Gerard, and then 2 minutes for comments from the floor.
Even one is sufficient, thank you. I would like to make a comment on how impressed I was, and this is in mirroring the comment from Janet about how much we have in common with the other people in the room for the breakout session, whether they come from manufacturing companies or CROs, academia, or regulators. And I think it's not to please ourselves, but I think this is a ground, fertile ground we can build upon for pursuing this work and not to having punctual, because we need to go on.
Turns out we're all scientists at the end of the day. Questions or comments from the floor? Yes, Charles. Yeah.
Wanted to comment on the skepticism scale. I thought that was interesting. It actually struck a chord with many of the things that we talked about in our breakout session. And it also reminded me of a phrase that was mentioned by Terry yesterday that talked about how us in industry have a conspiracy of optimism versus the necessity of skepticism. And at the time that bothered me, because I don't think that we have a conspiracy, but I realize that we're optimistic and that the regulators do have this necessity of skepticism. However, subjectivity is certainly a problem. And looking at your scepticism scale, it immediately brought a Bayesian approach to mind, because of course that's all that is. So you've got a lower prior, perhaps, than we do, and so you need a more convincing evidence to get to a particular level of probability. Whereas, a lot of the modeling that we're doing is trying to use that to work forward to a common goal. So we're all in the same business here, is finding drugs which are safe and effective for patients. And so trying to get away from subjectivity and using this Bayesian approach could be very helpful in approaching both the skepticism and the perhaps optimism with or without conspiracy.
Thanks, but it's all about putting people's feelings down in numbers and objectifying what's a subjective process at the moment, and that's something we talked about as well. Any others? Terry, final comment, please. Yeah,
just very quick. I think that there was a really concrete outcome in terms of this way of quantifying the assumptions and the impact on the decisions that you're making. And that's something that I would like to see go forward in the future, that there's additional work and testing of that in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Final comment, Dr. Stansky.
Could I ask the group, what do you consider the most underserved special area that in your discussions, what area needs the most work?
So that came out very clearly. It was clinical pharmacology, basic understanding.
So I think you meant patient group, did you?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I can't address that one, somebody else.
Gerard.
Additional piece of answer to Don. I agree with your comment, but I would add young children, and the younger, the worse. I mean, the worse studies evaluated, because they are the most different from adults. So we need to put more energy in digging this area. This is where the extrapolation is much more challenging, I would say.